Hello, I'm Jacqueline Holstead, and you are listening to On Point Conversations. In this podcast series, we share creative marketing, content, and branding strategies that help your business successfully navigate the new normal marketing environment. Hello, I'm Jacqueline Holstead, and in my podcast today, I started out, my title of the podcast is Your Clock Running Backwards? And the reason I entitled that is because if you had a clock that was running backwards, you would probably do, especially if you depended on it, a change to it. It either needed a new battery, it needed to be replaced. If it's an old antique clock that's been in your family for years, you may just turn it off. But you wouldn't be apt to say, oh, I can't do anything with that clock. It runs backwards. I just need to accept it. You would make the change. I think anyway. I would. So today I'm going to talk about reasons people resist change, because we as leaders come across this all the time, because change is kind of part of leadership. You have to face this resistance, you have to make the changes, and look at ways to make that resistance less apt to be in your team, or at least reduce the amount of resistance. So the first thing I would recommend is that when you're making those changes, or when you first of all are thinking about the changes, that you clearly identify what the problem is with the current system, what steps you need to fix it, who's going to all be involved, and then in your own mind even, or within your management team or group of mentors, experiment with the idea until as many kinks can be worked out as possible before you step forward. It may even be that your mentors say, well, you can change this part, but not this part, or shouldn't do this, or shouldn't do that. But just in your own mind, have a clear idea of why this is even necessary. Is there a problem? As I said in the beginning, leadership is about change. And we as leaders do face resistance. And resistance to change can manifest itself in many ways. It can go from people foot dragging, so they don't do it, inertia to pretty much sabotage to outright rebellions. So the best tools for leaders of change is to understand the predictable, universal sources of resistance in each situation, and then strategize around them. So today, we're going to assume that these are bigger changes. They probably could be a little bit less apt noticeable than the clock running backwards. Or they could be something that is a smaller change but still impacts a lot of people. So here are 10 things that are the most common resistance to changes and what you might do to combat those. The first one is loss of control. So change interferes, or can, with the autonomy someone might have, and can make people kind of feel like they've lost control over their own territory. I was in a company recently where they were changing some accounting methods, which made perfect sense what they were doing, but the issue was that the people who had this autonomy and were responsible for that felt a lot of threat and loss of control, because now they weren't as autonomous. People were looking at the process and helping them change it. So smart leaders, they leave room for those affected by change to make some choices. They invite others into the planning, and they give them a little bit more ownership on the changes so that it's not this big surprise, but that they've got the person or persons, many people who are being affected, can then have ownership into that change. The second resistance to change is uncertainty. So, change can feel like you're walking into a situation without the right tools to handle the situation. And when that happens, people will reject the change no matter what it is. Sometimes people will stay in a system that they complain about constantly instead of heading toward an unknown. You can kind of think about it like in Halloween when you walk into a ghost house. It can be pretty scary. So some people have a real scare in changing these particular situations. There's an uncertainty. So to overcome that obstacle, as leaders, we need to provide a sense of safety as well as an inspiring vision. Leaders should create certainty of the process by offering clear, simple steps and timetables for those processes to happen. Third resistance to change is surprise. Decisions imposed on people suddenly, with no time to get used to the idea or prepare for the consequences, are generally going to be resisted because it's always easier to say no than it is to say yes. I was in a sales meeting where the CEO talked to the sales team and thought he was really doing something very helpful about changing some of the ways that they've done business in the past. And it was very much a tense meeting. It wasn't the meeting the CEO expected. So leaders need to avoid the temptation to craft changes in secret and then announce them all at once like they're giving a big surprise party. It's really better to plant seeds, and that is to sprinkle hints of what might be coming and seeking their input. You might even, in leadership teams where it's a larger team, meet with people individually to, again, sprinkle those hints of what's coming and seek their input, because these are people that are being affected. So they might have some really input that you haven't even thought of, and you really want to include them. Another resistance to change is everything seems different. Well, that's change. Change is meant to bring something different. But how different? Because we tend to be creatures of habit, and routines become automatic. But change jolts us into consciousness, and sometimes it's uncomfortable. Too many differences can be distracting or confusing. So all of a sudden, when you're just, potentially throwing the baby out with the bath, you're going to meet resistance, and it might not be the best way to do it. So leaders really should try to minimize the number of unrelated differences introduced by a central change. And, whenever possible, keep something familiar and remain focused on the important things. And then again, as I've said before, but avoid change for the sake of change. It's not necessary to make a change if it actually is unnecessary. It's kind of redundant, but it's true that you can avoid the change for the sake of change. The other resistance to change is loss of face. So change is a departure from the past. Generally it is. And those people associated with the last version, and I'm talking about the ones that worked on it, or they developed it, and now that work is being basically told it doesn't work anymore and it needs to be superseded, could become very defensive about it. So when change involves a big shift of strategic direction, the people responsible for the previous direction dread the perception that they might have done something wrong. So kind of put yourself in the situation and the shoes of these other people. So as a leader, put yourself in the shoes of other people and help people maintain dignity by celebrating those elements of the past that are worth honoring and making it clear that the world or some process has changed, and it makes it easier to let go and move on. The other resistance to change is concerns about ability, and that would be people saying, thinking to themselves, can I do it? Because change is resisted when it makes people feel stupid. And sometimes when we're in the learning process, we shouldn't feel stupid. We should feel like learning, but then you might have that resistance of people feeling stupid. So they might express skepticism about whether let's say if the new website version is going to work, or the change is really important. But kind of down deep, they're worried that their skills will be obsolete, or they won't be able to understand it or figure it out. So leaders need to overinvest time and resources in providing enough information, education, training, mentors, support systems, all those things in place, and a period of overlap. If it's possible to run the two systems simultaneously, that kind of helps ease transition. Sometimes that's not possible, so learning the system first before you pull the other system away is also a good idea. And beta versions. You're trying it and seeing where the kinks are right away versus putting it into action and then trying to figure out where the kinks are. Another resistance to change is more work, and that's really the universal challenge, because change is going to be more work, at least when you're changing. And those closest to the change in terms of, say, designing or testing, they're going to be overloaded, in part because it's pretty inevitable that you're going to see unanticipated glitches in the middle of the change. Everything can look like a failure in the middle. It's a Cantor's law. But leaders should really acknowledge the hard work of a change by allowing some people to focus exclusively on it, or adding some extra perks for the participants. They should be rewarded and recognized. Another resistance to change is the ripple effect. So let's say you go to a lake and you toss a pebble in. You've probably done that, or a pond, and the change creates this ripple, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then you have this ever widening circle where you just threw it in one spot, but it got bigger. Well, ripples can disrupt other departments. You can disrupt customers, important customers, people well outside the venture or neighborhood, and they start to push back, rebelling against the change because they had nothing to do with it, and it's an interference to their own activities. So leaders really need to enlarge that circle of stakeholders. Consider all the affected parties, however distant, and work with them prior to the change to minimize disruption. So it's really thinking from a visionary standpoint, what is going to happen when that system is put in place and who's it going to affect? And it can be, if it's an accounting system, it can affect all the way down to people getting paid, how they're paid, how they see their paycheck, how they see their statements, all kinds of things. So keep that in mind. Another resistance to change is past resistance. And this is really a hard one because this becomes the ghost of the past. They're kind of lying in wait because everything has gone along in a steady state and that kind of remains out of sight. But the minute you need cooperation for something new and different, those ghosts spring into action. Old wounds can reopen. There can be some historic resentments are remembered. There can be things going on. So I would say as leaders, consider if you can find out what happened in the past, gestures kind of to heal the past before you just go sailing into the future. Now, the last resistance to change is sometimes the threat is real. Now we get to the true pain in politics. Change is resisted because it can hurt. And when new technology displaces old ones, jobs can be cut, prices can be cut, investments can be wiped out. So the best thing, and really the only thing leaders can do when the changes they seek or need pose significant threats is you have to be honest, transparent, fast, and fair. For example, rather than laying off bit by bit, you might want to do one big layoff. Just knowing that you got to kind of rip that bandage off. And although we as leaders really can't make everyone feel comfortable with change, we can minimize the stress and discomfort. Because there are ways to help people who are displaced. Maybe they can go to another part of the company if you're in a larger company. Maybe you can help them with a good recommendation to someone else because it's not their fault. It's just a change that made them be displaced. Try to find the sources of resistance. That's really the first step towards some good solutions. And get feedback from the resistors at first because that can be really helpful in improving the process and therefore gaining acceptance for change. So now that you've heard all these resistance to change, take a careful look at what change you want to make and is it necessary, and how are you going to do it with the least amount of resistance because you're going to make it an easier process for change. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. If you have any comments or you want me to talk about something else or you'd like some help with anything, you can contact me at onpointthinking.com. And this is Jacqueline Holstead. And I hope this particular podcast helps you. I try to put a new podcast out every week on Thursdays generally. And I look forward to keeping you as a listener. Thank you and have a really great day. Thank you for listening, and I invite you to join me next week as we talk more about specific actions you can take to reach your own business goals. You can find my library of other inspiring podcasts like this one at onpointthinking.com. Again, thank you for listening. This is Jacqueline Holstead at On Point Conversations.